Well, thank you, everybody, for looking in on this get-together we have here. It's a very exciting time for me because this represents the first fusion that we have here of a meaningful nature between this wonderful setup at ELCAT and Pioneer Valley Radio, two forms of what I like to refer to as 21st century media getting together to do something I think that is of a fairly compelling nature. So my thanks to Don Mackey, and my special thanks to my special guest, who I'm very happy to say is a friend, and I've known this gentleman ever since he burst forth on the political scene, Senator Eric Lesser.
Thanks,
Eric,
Brad.
it's good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you, too.
I still got a little bit of a turkey hangover here, but
I know, don't we all? Yeah. Well, when you assumed office, Senator, in 2014, you pledged to advocate for high-tech jobs and training, and you said you would work to ensure that Western Mass was not ignored or shortchanged for opportunities by Beacon Hill, which is a formidable task to take on. So how would you characterize your progress in those areas in the last 4 years?
Yeah, well, I think if we're at East Long Meadow High School, so if we have a report card here, it's incomplete because it's still very much a work in progress. Yeah. But I do think, when I ran as a 28-year-old, one of the things I talked about for Western Mass was the need for us to connect ourselves to the red-hot economies just to our east and just to our south. And we've made real progress towards that goal. Just a few examples, Brad. Just this past session, we passed a major new economic development bill, tens of millions of new dollars in new laboratory space at UMass Amherst, for example. New Voc Tech programs and advanced manufacturing programs at STIC, at the Lower Pioneer Valley Education Collaborative in West Springfield. Right. These are essential programs that teach our young people how to make the components for solar panels, how to make the high-tech components for wind turbines and 21st century products. And we've made real progress towards what I think is the ultimate need we have, which is high-speed rail service between Western Mass and Eastern Mass. People have been talking about this for decades. We finally have a study in the works after years of effort. Yep. And Brad, you have covered this extensively know the backstory here, but we now have a commitment from the governor to study this issue. So we've got really forward momentum and a lot to be excited about.
I want to come back to that in just a moment because I know that is a piece of pet legislation for you, the high-speed rail between the east and west part of the state. I also know that you've written that you believe home health care specifically should be more affordable for our aging population to allow seniors to stay in their homes if entirely possible. Your plan also includes 2 points, if I have it correct here, regarding the physical and financial security of the elderly, that the state should provide increased oversight of in-home health care agencies in order to reduce instances of elder abuse. Right. Which is pretty shameful, but it does happen. And you have supported the increased availability of computer and financial literacy for older Americans and older people here in the region, for the simple reason that shamefully more and more of them have fallen prey to scams. Yep. To predators. So how has that been moving along for you?
Yeah, so to zoom out, so folks at home, who are following this, the issue we have is increasingly a lot of our population is aging, especially in Western Mass. We have higher numbers of elderly folks in our communities like East Long Meadow where we are, but really across Western Mass. It's not unique to this town. So you have higher numbers of people who are living alone. Often their kids, their grandkids are not local, partly because of these economic issues we've talked about. Their kids and grandkids have had to move elsewhere. So you have a situation where people are isolated, and unfortunately we do see increasing cases of financial fraud, scammers, these phone calls people get saying, sign on the dotted line here, or sign up for this program and we'll send you X, Y, and Z, and it almost never works as intended. So what we've tried to do is get more resources to the Attorney General's office, try to do more public outreach. We've worked very closely with our senior centers, but the other important point on home health care specifically, we need to make sure we keep people out of hospitals and out of nursing homes as long as possible. The quality of life is better when people are in their own homes, when people are able to kind of age in the home where they're comfortable, but we do need to make sure that it's properly managed and supervised. So that includes stricter licensing and more training, and it also includes, Brad, more pay for these home health workers. If you raise the pay and raise the standards, you're going to have a higher quality person in there caring for the elderly person, and you're going to be able to get better services for the person.
I couldn't agree more with that, because we've seen case after case of our seniors who suddenly are taken out of a habitat that they've been comfortable in.
Right.
And it affects them emotionally and psychologically, and ultimately can cause a decline. So yes, raising the pay of the healthcare workers, the in-home healthcare workers, how do you fund that?
Well, so what you can do is you can replow savings from the nursing home admissions back into home healthcare reimbursement. So for example, your typical stay in a nursing home is many orders of magnitude more expensive than your typical hourly home healthcare attendant would be. This is part of the reason why you really want only the most critical cases in our nursing homes. Folks that just maybe need help getting dressed, help eating, or maybe just wellness checks during the day. You really don't need to be in a nursing home for that. So what you can do is you can actually increase the pay, plow some of the savings from lowering the admission rates at the nursing homes back into home health care, back into wellness, physical activity programs, and outreach programs at our senior centers. It's important for people to appreciate, because we've seen this with our nursing homes around the state. This is a huge cost for Mass Health, and even relatively small changes to the admission rates, keeping people out of hospitals, keeping people out of nursing homes longer, is going to net massive savings for the state, and we can plow that back into more prevention and more community outreach.
Excellent. Well, let's circle back to your signature legislation of connection between the east and west part of the state, the rail, which is gaining widespread support, no question about that, and attention from candidates ahead of the 2018 election, or the next election in 2020.
That's when you definitely know it's picking up steam, right? Yeah. When people start citing it on the campaign trail.
They do, when it becomes a campaign issue.
Yeah.
Well, you have committed to ensuring that the issue remains at the forefront of the lawmakers' agendas in the coming months and years. So when you talk about the traction of the study that you're pleased to hear that has been approved and begun, you've gotten some criticism from folks saying this is redundant, that there's a federal study, so why do we need to pay for this additional study? How do you respond to that?
It's not redundant. Look, if we wanted to build it tomorrow, I'd be all for that. But it turns out that a lot of the same critics that say don't do the study's redundant, are also against just doing it. So the reality of it is the study, the federal study you're referring to, the NERI study, the Northern New England Intercity Rail Initiative study, which I've followed closely and have been involved with, and actually was involved with in a peripheral way during my time in the Obama administration, is a broad view of the entire rail corridor from New York City all the way to Montreal and from Springfield to Boston. It's more than 400 miles of total track it looked at. And specifically in the NERI study, it said that further implementation is going to be up to the individual states, because that was a collaborative effort between Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and the other New England states. So what this is actually doing is this is bringing to a next step that umbrella level federal study that was completed a few years ago. We're going to need Massachusetts to lead on this in order to make it happen. There will undoubtedly be a federal component. We'll eventually need federal funds to make it happen, but Massachusetts needs to step out and make the case for why this is important first. I'll give you an example, Brad. In Connecticut, the new Connecticut Rail project, which connects New Haven, Hartford to Springfield, which has opened with a lot of fanfare in Springfield over the last several months, and has, by the way, been a huge success. That was really Connecticut stepping out and saying, we want to make this a priority. Now, they had a lot of federal help. They had stimulus money. They had federal transportation aid that helped them. But the governor of Connecticut, the legislature of Connecticut stepped out and said, this is a priority. And they did the studies and they did the legwork to make it happen. That's what we need to do in Massachusetts with East-West Rail.
Well, let's back up a little bit and tell me what you consider to be the most significant need for east-west rail connection in
Yeah.
Massachusetts?
It's very simple. We need to be connected to jobs. You know, and the other piece of this is they're complementary needs. Because when I'm in Boston and when I'm talking to legislators in Boston, I'm talking to community folks in the Boston area, the single biggest issue they have is out of control cost of housing, out of control rent. No one can afford to live there. The traffic is asphyxiating. No one can move around. The T is falling apart.
Oh, no.
They actually have the inverse challenge to us. They have a booming economy with lots of high-paying jobs, but they can't get around, and costs are ballooning out of control because there's a housing shortage. Western Mass has the inverse challenge. We have great open space. We have a very low cost of living relative to Boston, but what we don't have is access to those high-paying jobs. So connecting both ends of the state creates a complementary system where we get access to those high-paying jobs. Boston gets access to the housing market. You think about communities like East Longmeadow or communities in Springfield, the housing values would quadruple overnight. The jobs it would create, the spin-off benefits would be incredible. So that's really the goal. The goal has got to be, is the service fast enough, reliable enough, and frequent enough to actually be an option for people who live in Western Mass to get jobs in Eastern Mass?
I know that some of the pushback that you get on this issue stems from the fact that people will say, look, our entire infrastructure is decaying here. Our bridges are falling apart. Our dams are falling apart. The nature of our roads are devouring cars and costing us a fortune. Where is the priority in regard to this? Where do you place the ailing Massachusetts infrastructure and the need for east-west rail?
Well, it's a great question, Brad, and I'm sensitive to that. But, you know, we've got a lot of young people watching today, and we're here at a high school. And I don't think that we should have to be trapped by, frankly, bad decisions that have been made in the past, which was to not invest in our infrastructure. You know, I was in Asia recently, a few months ago, and I saw the rail system there. And you think about the investments that they're making. There's now more concrete getting poured every year in China than in the rest of the world combined. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. This country put a man on the moon. We built the Erie Canal before there were power tools. You know, that same mindset, if we had that a generation, 2, 3 generations ago, we would never have the Golden Gate Bridge. We would never have the Hoover Dam. We wouldn't have the interstate highway system. So yes, we need to maintain the infrastructure we have. There's no doubt about that, and we need to catch up on the backlog of failed maintenance we have across this state. Bridges that are, we had a bridge connecting Wilbraham and Ludlow, the Red Bridge. We worked for over 2 years to get that bridge reopened. I used to joke, you know, if that bridge was connecting 2 communities in Eastern Mass, it would have been fixed overnight. So I know full well the challenge we've got with our infrastructure, but if we don't think in the future about where future needs are going to be and where growth is going to come from and how we create jobs and opportunities for the people in this studio, the young people in this studio, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. The way I frame this to people is we need a thorough analysis of the cost of the project. But what has to be understood about the cost is what is the cost of not doing it? What is the cost of not investing in this infrastructure? What is the cost of Western Mass continuing to fall behind, of Western Mass continuing to be disconnected from the job growth and the wage growth in our state? That has a cost too, and that needs to be thought about and baked into the calculation as well.
So true. But here you come, you find yourself up against the age-old problem that so many of our Massachusetts legislative representatives, our Western Mass legislative reps have come across, is how do you get Beacon Hill to care about Western Mass issues in the sense that you hear horrific comments once in a while. People slip and say they think that Framingham is Western Mass or that Western Mass ends at Natick. You know, how do you get them to really care about the issues out here as we're here in the Springfield environs and we're almost out into the Berkshires? How do you get Beacon Hill to care?
It's a challenge, Brad. You know, if you add up the entire population of all 4 counties of Western Mass, Berkshire, Franklin, Hampshire, Hamden, and even if you throw in some of the far western parts of Worcester County, it's still only about 12, at most 18% of the state's population. So the key is 2 things. Number 1, we have to make the argument that this is not for Western Mass, right? East-West Rail just as an example, but there's a lot of issues where we make this argument. This is not a project for Western Mass. This is a project for our entire state. By helping Western Mass, we also help Eastern Mass. To go back to my point earlier, what's their single biggest challenge? Complete overheating of their economy, complete degradation and collapse of their public transit, and skyrocketing housing costs as a result. We can help them with that with East-West Rail. So it's about making an argument that this is for the entire state. If you make the argument that this is a pet project for me, or this is a pet project for Greater Springfield, you're never going to get anywhere, and you shouldn't, because the job of the legislature is to make laws for the whole state. So it's about making that case, and it's also about building partnerships and building relationships to help make that happen. So I'll give you an example. We now have the Springfield Chamber of Commerce and the Boston Chamber of Commerce behind us supporting this rail initiative. We have major business leaders in Western Mass and major business leaders in Eastern Mass working on this issue, because we've done the work of going out and talking to people and educating them about why this is so important.
Absolutely, and the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to give anybody the platform to dismiss this as more pork or more pie in the sky. Or any other food analogy you like, and there's always that danger. How does this all key in with the new emphasis on transportation in Springfield? You have the big, beautiful new Union Station that Congressman Neal has been behind since God was a boy. It's finally come to fruition. Does this work for you in your endeavor for East-West Rail connection, or against it?
Absolutely. I mean, I view this all as complementary. I was with Congressman Neal yesterday at an event in Agawam, and we were talking about this and about the potential for an infrastructure bill in the new Congress, which would, of course, be great news for New England and for Massachusetts, which desperately needs that funding. All of this works together, Brad, because you have this fantastic, beautiful new building. Now we need trains coming in and out of it. You have a $1 billion entertainment and casino complex with MGM. We need visitors from all over the country, all over the world, hopefully, to come make it a success. You have a new Dr. Seuss museum. Actually, shortly after this interview, I'm heading over to the Springfield Museums to announce new funding for the Dr. Seuss Museum, which has been a runaway success, is attracting visitors from all over the region, all over the country. All of these items need to work in tandem with each other. We still have the Big E that has to be integrated. We still have Six Flags that needs to be integrated. We have new convention space and exhibit space and new energy at the Mass Mutual Center. The Thunderbirds have been a runaway hit. Their games are, getting sellouts. So all of this is about building off of the success of each one. And my fear is if we miss this moment of optimism, this moment of investment and attention in Springfield, it's going to be a generation before we get it back, and we've been there before.
You just anticipated me, because you're right. You've got there's a confluence right now of all of this new stuff happening, and there's a glowing core between the casino, the Big E, the museums, the new transportation hub. It's an opportunity now, and this window, like any window, doesn't stay open forever.
Exactly.
And the one thing that we don't want to do is rock back into that complacent time where, let's face it, the region was moribund. It was when I came here 25 years ago. It isn't now. But this would be the wrong time to rest on laurels.
Exactly.
And the right time to say, okay, what's the next rung on this ladder to keep everything moving? Let me pull out a little bit here and pull back a little bit and ask you about something that I thought was intriguing, and that is your position on the Electoral College. I don't like it.
I'm not a fan, no.
You're not a fan of the Electoral College. And I've come up in my life believing that this was a great system to flatten out the vote and make everybody's vote count, that representative democracy is assisted by this, But you see it differently. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, not to parachute into national politics here, but what I do think is important for people to recognize is that the Electoral College, I actually think in a way, is exacerbating divisions in the country rather than helping to mute them. And something that the founders did not foresee was the hyper growth in population, in a handful of states. So what you might end up seeing in the near future because of demographic changes in the country is a president that consistently loses the popular vote because the big states, Texas, Florida, California, run up huge margins, but then also wins the Electoral College vote. And if it happens once every 100 years or 125 years, which is what the norm was, that's one thing. But if you start to see consistent and regular cases of presidents getting elected that don't have a popular mandate from the public, to me, that's a recipe for a lot of problems. So I think we need to rethink this. I think we need to think about how structurally the Electoral College marginalizes certain groups. It especially, I think, marginalizes urban voters, voters that live in cities. There is no doubt that someone's vote in Massachusetts, this is a mathematical fact, is worth less than somebody's vote in a Midwest or Mountain West state. That's just math. That's not politics. That's the way the Electoral College is designed. There are certainly, I'm a student of history, there are legitimate and thoughtful arguments in the other direction, but I think in this moment in time and where we're heading as a country and the divisions you've seen in our politics over the last generation really that have really come to a boil now, it's worth revisiting this. We can't have legitimacy in our elections and in our leaders if people feel like their votes are not being counted.
With that said, my question is there a potential danger in creating a system where anybody running for this high office would only have to run in our truly populous centers of New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and so forth, and somebody and the voter in Idaho or Wyoming doesn't seem to matter as much anymore. This would work against, I think, the way the whole system was designed.
Oh, I think that's a very fair argument, and that's probably the strongest argument for the current system. And look, we face a small version of this in Massachusetts because we elect, for example, our governors on just a straight popular vote, which is a recipe for Western Mass often getting left out because we're not where the population center is. So as a Western Mass legislator, I understand this intuitively. So, I don't have it all figured out yet, but what I do know is the current system is not working, and people's connectivity to politics is breaking down, partly because the structures of our politics have not caught up with where the country is and where society is. So I think we need something new. I'm not sure exactly what that would be, but I do think we need to have conversations like the one we're having. We need young people engaged in these conversations about what a new system would look like. Look, the country, our democracy has been iterative in its systems for a very long time. The idea that the Constitution was written 250 years ago and has been static ever since is completely false. There have been amendments, there have been major structural changes to how we conduct elections. Senators used to be picked by state legislatures as just one example. Electors used to not be picked by popular vote at all. So there have been many times in our history where we've taken a step back and looked at our systems and decided that they need an update, and we haven't done that in a while now, and I think the current tension in our politics is a reflection of that.
Well, I give you a lot of points, Eric, for taking a brave stance on something as revolutionary as that concept
I appreciate
and that
that.
idea. So we'll see where, I know that there are others who feel the way you do. We'll see where it goes. So let me ask you this question. Let's bring things back to Massachusetts, and that is that I support you completely and totally in the vigorous stance that you've taken on the opioid addiction, which is a crisis, which is a scourge tearing at the fabric of everything around here. We have towns in our region that are submerged in this. The town of Ware is just overflowing with the opioid. You've got fire departments now. Sad commentary. It's great because it will save a life, but how awful it is that fire departments have to be equipped with Narcan now as a measurement of how serious this is. So here we are, you're fighting this battle, and now there's a rearguard action to legalize marijuana. And that puts you in a funky position because how do you reflect the will and the desires of your constituency, and at the same time deal with the position you've taken on the opioid addiction issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't view them as mutually exclusive. If anything, properly managed and properly supervised, legalizing marijuana will actually help in our battles against the opioid crisis, because there'll be alternatives for people to have supervised ways to manage pain, deal with anxiety and stress, things like that in the medical marijuana context. What I will say is, in terms of the opioid crisis and in terms of focusing on that, it was a major priority for me, and we talked about this in previous times we've been together, to really get universal access to Narcan, because what we were seeing was an emergency. It was and we're still in an emergency, but you had people literally dying every single day, dozens a week, 4 or 5 a day on average in Massachusetts, and we needed the access to the Narcan in order to stop that. I thought we had a moral obligation to stop the dying, and what you actually saw was a recent Department of Public Health report that showed that access to Narcan did help tick the death rate down somewhat. But what we need to do moving forward is we need to continue to get a handle on the out-of-control prescription drug abuse. Three-quarters of heroin, of people addicted to heroin in Massachusetts began with legally obtained prescription drugs. This country, this state, saw basically legalized drug dealing on a massive scale. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. So we need to do more to get a handle on that. Massachusetts became the first state in a bipartisan way, working with the legislature and the governor, to put a 7-day limit on new opioid prescriptions. I've worked and I've supported increasing our sectioning process and making the sectioning local, so that people who have to be sectioned or are sectioned by a loved one are not ripped from their community here in Western Mass and sent to Eastern Mass in a paddy wagon. That's inhumane. There were cases of people dying from that kind of treatment. We worked with Sheriff Kochi and others to bring that treatment local.
Yeah.
But we also have to do more, Brad. We have to look forward at how we got into this mess in the first place. And I think it's important for the public to appreciate that this all happened under our nose.
Oh, yeah.
The drug companies were marketing these drugs, and prescribers were issuing them without a full appreciation, or in some cases knowing and willingly turning the other way to the effects. So I've supported, for example, new efforts in the legislature to change our consumer liability laws so that we can prevent this from happening in the future, so that law enforcement, our attorneys general, others can go in and can say to drug companies and to pharmaceutical companies, no, you have an obligation to act responsibly and to not put profits before people. So that's an effort that's going to be ongoing, and let me tell you, that's a big fight to take on the pharmaceutical industry, especially in this state.
Right.
But we need to have honest conversations about this. One other piece on this is we need to also step back, and the root causes of the opioid crisis are, of course, multifaceted, but one of the most important things to appreciate is people that feel like they have a stake in their future don't turn to substance abuse. And we need to acknowledge that all of this is interconnected. The growing challenges in our economy, the continued economic isolation, some of the communities you referenced that are the hardest hit by the opioid crisis are also the ones that have seen the highest number of job losses in the last several years, have seen the highest number of their young people having to leave their families to go find work, are also the communities struggling to keep their school systems competitive. So we need to appreciate that all of this is interconnected. We need to create opportunities, we need to create jobs, we need to create a stake in people's future so that they don't resort to self-medicating and to turning to substance abuse as a result.
Very well said. Well, I didn't wish you congratulations on the most recent election.
Oh, thank you. I
Congratulations.
appreciate that. Thank you.
And it brings me to this. You've been a sitting senator now for 4 years, since 2014. Okay.
Feels like it's shorter than that.
Maybe that's a good thing. So tell me something. Now that you've been in the gig for 4 years, what have you found that surprised you about a career in the Senate that you perhaps didn't anticipate when you were moving toward this?
Well, one thing I really found is on a state level, at least, I had worked in Washington. I felt very blessed that I really actually got to start my career working for President Obama.
Yes, I know.
I started on his first campaign in 2007, 2008. But quite frankly, I'd gotten very disillusioned with Washington and with everything that was happening in Washington. And, part of me almost felt like I was done with politics and I wanted to go try something else. What I've really found satisfying and exciting about state politics is, it's my constituents hold me accountable in the supermarket line, the playground with my kids, at the soccer game on Saturday morning. Politics is much more real and much closer on a state level, and you just frankly don't have time for all the games and all the nonsense that you see on national politics. So what I've really appreciated about it is if you're focused, and if you kind of, focus less on who's getting credit for what, you really can get a lot of cool stuff done. And I've really enjoyed that. There's certainly been frustrating moments. There's certainly been times where you want to pull your hair out. But overall, I would say state politics, I'd really encourage, especially the young people that are here, put Twitter away, turn off CNN, turn off Fox, turn off MSNBC, go out into your community, go volunteer, go get involved in your school, go get involved in your school committee, go get involved in politics on the most local level. You're going to find actually a lot of fun people who might not agree with you on everything, but who share a common interest in improving our community.
We have a very quiet and very attentive studio audience here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, 15 young people. And I look at them and I think to myself, when I was their age, ooh, what a scary thought. When I was their age, I don't think we really had an issue with fake news.
Yeah.
I think the journalism was much more solid, much more responsible, and had greater credibility and standards. Unfortunately, these young people are swamped with an awful lot of nation building in the news and an awful lot of fake news. What's your best advice to them to find out what the heck is going on in the world today from East Longmeadow to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, great question. And I really want to applaud the young people who are here for being involved because, we live in a cynical time, and frankly, the trendy thing to do is to just, curse the wind and go focus on something else. So my advice really to you all would be to get involved, just volunteer, learn with your own eyes and ears what's happening. Instead of reading about something, on Twitter, go out and participate. If you have a candidate that you're interested in, go to an event and meet that candidate and go talk to them, or run yourself. That's really the key. The other thing I think we need to do, on a policy level is we need our schools to catch up. We need to reinstill civics in our classrooms. We need to teach civics, and we need to teach media literacy. We actually just had 2 weeks ago, the governor signed a new bill, a really nation-leading bill. Massachusetts is going to be reinstituting really robust civics curriculums in our public schools, which will include a service learning component, which we worked hard to integrate. Because the idea being that if you just get out there and meet people, that breaks down a lot of the stigma. Go volunteer with your local police department. Go volunteer at your local senior center. You're going to learn more about senior policy or about these issues we talked about home care by just volunteering than you will necessarily by reading about it on social media.
Isn't it just a little bit shocking to you that we've had to turn around and address or readdress an absence of civics being taught in our educational systems?
We're paying the price, frankly, because I think a lot of the problems in politics right now stem from the fact that people do not feel equipped to participate. And I'll give you an example, Brad. My first term in the Senate, I ran an initiative called the Millennial Engagement Initiative. And basically what we did is we drove all over the state and we had roundtables with young people. We did one in Lawrence in Spanish with a translator. We went to Fall River. We went to Holyoke. We went to Springfield. We went to Quincy. We went all over. We went to Paxton. We went all over the state. And one commonality that we heard time and time again was, this generation wants to get involved.
Yeah.
Volunteerism rates are at all-time highs. Community service rates are at all-time highs. But people would often say to us, look, I don't even know, who's my legislator? How does a bill become a law? What is your job? And that's really dangerous because, public education was premised on the notion that it was meant to enable people to be citizens. Before you learn the quadratic equation, before you learn the periodic table of the elements,
yes.
you learned how to be an active citizen in your democracy because that's what protects your freedom. And we lost sight of that, quite frankly, in the modern era when we got very, very focused on important subjects like math, science. I mean, all those things are important. But we ended up crowding out, I think, the foundational role each of us plays to each other in a democracy, and that's the role of citizenship.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's very nice and lovely for our young students if they can explain the Pythagorean theory to you, but they also need to be able to tell me what the three chambers of government are. And the name of the vice president and things like that. That's important too.
Or understanding a right.
Yeah.
What's a foundational right in our society, and what's a privilege, and the difference between a right and a privilege.
Thank
These are
you.
foundational elements of our society, and if people don't know them, they can't protect their own freedom, and they're left to be in a very vulnerable situation.
So let me ask you this: what has been most pleasing to you about the last 4 years on the job in the Senate?
Wow, great. Probably the single thing that I probably got the most excitement about and that I probably had the most joy about. Well, first, what was kind of fun, there was a lot of change in my life over the last 4 years.
Yeah.
My first daughter was a baby. She was just a little over a year old when I got sworn in. My first term, for my
Wonderful.
second term, she was a little older, and our second child was literally a few weeks old. She was born on Christmas Day 2 years ago, and now starting my third term, the littlest one is about to turn 2, and Rose has started kindergarten, which is fun. So there's been a lot of great moments in my personal life that I've been very grateful for. But I would say professionally, we did quite a lot of work to kind of back up to the beginning of our conversation around high-tech job training and especially around precision manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. One of the first meetings I took very, very early on in my first term, I got brought over to the Lower Pioneer Valley Education Collaborative in West Springfield. And Andy Churchill, who's the superintendent there, great community leader, showed me a big empty room, bigger than this studio, big empty room, saying that they had a horticulture program, they had a mechanic program for automotive, they had a beautician program, cosmetology program, but they didn't have a program in advanced manufacturing. And he showed me this big open room, and he said, we want to buy the machinery to get this started because we've got a lot of local employers that are looking to hire people. So we put an item together for funding for this. It was a modest amount of money, $200,000, in the scheme of the state budget, not a huge item. We were able to buy that equipment. The very next year, was able to come back after that equipment was purchased and meet the students working on these different training machines. And one of the great honors was to then go to their graduation of the first class. And that class had a more than 95% placement rate into jobs in the area. Really good high-tech jobs, things like CAD/CAM programming, precision machining. Jobs that are going to give them an immediate middle-class life and are going to give them a pathway to potentially opening their own shops and their own businesses down the line. And what it really taught me is despite the messiness and the frustrations of politics, despite the repeated times you want to pull your hair out or bang your head against the wall in frustration, politics is still the way we collectively invest in our future.
Sure.
And is the most important way, I think, to make a difference for people. And so learning that and seeing the grit that's involved in making that happen has been probably the most fulfilling experience.
The other side of that question is, what's been your greatest regret?
Well, if you ask my wife, it's probably I'm not home enough.
That's reasonable.
No, my regret is that we weren't. Frankly, I would like to have seen the rail get moving sooner. I was frustrated by the pace of that. But like anything in life, finding balance between your home, your personal life, your work is something that all of us face. My wife has a vibrant career of her own.
Yes.
So balancing those issues are issues every family around here and really everywhere is balancing. So learning that and kind of growing into that and learning more about myself has been a
That's
great
wonderful.
experience too.
Well, here we are in the holiday season, and one of the things that I thought was so interesting about your career was back when you were working in the Obama administration, you introduced the former president to his very first Seder.
Yes, yeah.
Now, what I want to know is, what was his favorite food?
Oh yeah. Well, he actually was a big fan of all the traditional, Jewish foods. The Passover Seder, for people who aren't familiar with it, is the sort of festive meal you eat to mark Passover, which is from the book of Exodus, that commemorates the Israelites escaping bondage in Egypt and making their way to Israel. It's a universal story about redemption and an escape from slavery, and it has frankly obvious connections to our own experience in the United States with slavery. But I got to tell you, the first family, the President Obama, Mrs. Obama, his daughters used to come. They were big fans of all the typical traditional foods you eat, the haroset, the matzah. The one thing that he wasn't a big fan of was the gefilte fish, but you can't blame him for that. Most people aren't.
That's an acquired taste.
Exactly.
Is that it? Well, Senator Eric Lesser, it's been a pleasure to spend this time with you and find out a little bit more about what makes you tick and what's been going on with your signature pieces of legislation. I think you've been very, very forthcoming, and it's been a real pleasure. And also, I want to thank Don Mackey and everybody here at ELCAT and Pioneer Valley Radio for the fusion on this particular program, and I hope that we have more of them. So a very happy holiday to you and your family, Senator.
You too, Brad. Thank you.
You bet.